Thank you, Chairman Bennett. I'm Lawrence Taft. I'm the Executive Director of the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. The Audubon Society is an independent organization. We have 17,000 members and supporters. Next to the state of Rhode Island, we probably own more land than anybody else in Rhode Island. With our refuges and our conservation easements, about 10,000 acres of land. About 1% of the state. The Audubon Society of Rhode Island is very much in support of this bill, the Woodland Stewardship Bill. It's a bill that I see, and I'm not going to read the testimony, but I think of it as prior to the 1970s when wetlands had no protection at all. Wetlands were just the areas in Rhode Island that had not yet been filled for some other useful purpose. And nowadays we really do recognize the environmental benefits of wetlands for storm protection, water cleaning, habitat, and all that. And nowhere in Rhode Island law does it really recognize the value of woodlands. Right now, woodlands in Rhode Island are just the land that has not yet been developed yet. That's it. But we're now becoming much more aware of the environmental services that our upland woodlands have. Of course, from the Audubon Society's perspective, we're about birds and habitat. So obviously, we're very concerned with the habitat value of woodlands. But also, a week ago, we were talking about woodlands and all the value of carbon sequestration and climate change adaptability and watershed and soils and recreation. And also the wood industry, which is a $700 million annual business here in Rhode Island. You know, people who service trees or cut trees or harvest trees, providing 3,000 jobs. This bill isn't about regulation. It's about considering woods as an environmental resource, just as DEM has considerations over farms and farming, fish and fisheries, and soils and water. Woodland is ignored. There's no place under all these different rules where woodland is actually named as a resource, and it is now finally becoming recognized. So we hope that this bill will pass to establish some set policy to really preserve the integrity of our woods, give DEM some say, so that we can start to plan, give them the permission, if you will, to come up with this group to study this, try to come up with recommendations, and to allow towns to have some guidance in future planning. This doesn't create any new administration or any new bureaucracy. So I hope that you will consider this bill and pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative McLaughlin.
Yes, thank you for the work that you do. What do you think that is?
Why do you think that is? Well, as you know, most woodlands, the ones that aren't already protected, the state has the state forestry for all those lands that the state itself owns. But most lands, what, the 50% of what we currently is not still there, is in private hands. I'm going to take my Audubon hat off because I'm actually a woodland owner myself. I own 30 acres of woods out in Foster. The taxes I need to pay on the property in order to keep it, there's not really much of an incentive for me to not build on it or to have a solar on my acres, but I'd like not to. The idea that maybe the state could work on programs and incentives for landowners out in places like Foster and Situate, Coventry and West Greenwich, or even small forests that might see woodlands in Cranston or East Greenwich, more urbanized areas, as a way to not just have it be a foregone conclusion that that is land that's going to be developed and is taxed that way. So really looking for DEM to kind of come up with some priorities, provide towns with some guidance to help protect those woodlands that we do have, and not just have it be a foregone conclusion that Rhode Island will be wall-to-wall houses and businesses with no woods left at all, except for those ones that were purchased outright. That's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Taft, another question. I'm sorry. Representative Walsh.
I just want a little bit of clarification between the difference of language between forest land and woodland. A quick Google search shows it's acreage. I just wanted to know if there's any does one matter more than the other? Is there a specific?
No, not really. I think that in terms of this statute, it was really just trying to come up with a definition and use that word consistently through.
Awesome, thank you.
Speaker Pro Tem Kennedy?
Thank you. It's an interesting concept, and I know my town, and as we talked about last week at our hearing here, has been under assault by the applications for the solar projects. However, my concern about this is if in fact today these individuals who own large tracts of property can put those into the farm forest open space program, and that's a great thing. However, in my town of Hopkinton, a significant amount of acreage has already been taken off the tax rolls. Now, one of the biggest complaints we're hearing from taxpayers in the town of Hopkinton is how much their taxes are going to be going up in the next year. They projected over 85 cents per thousand, which is above the tax that they're allowed to raise it, so they have to come to the state in order to do so. If you take more off of the tax rolls, you're only forcing those people who still can afford to live in the town of Hopkinton to have to see their taxes go up even more. That's a concern, and that's a big concern, because a lot of senior citizens live in the town of Hopkinton, and the last thing I want to see is their taxes having to go up even more because of this, you know.
This bill does not talk about taking land off tax rolls. It's really just to form a group, a committee, to look at the preferences, to look at where there are areas of concern with large block forests, and start to make recommendations on how best to preserve and steward forests.
But I'm reading in this that it has the Department of Environmental Management involved,
Yep.
and then it also says that the local communities
Correct.
have to come up with rules and regulations and such like that.
Sure.
Ultimately, that sounds to me like taking more property off the tax rolls.
A community may decide to do that through some kind of programs like the open space programs, but again, this is just simply to put woodlands as a resource in the language of many bills, just as farms are, or the fisheries are, or soils and that kind of thing. So it's not about tax rolls. It's just to consider the environmental services that woodlands do provide, and we all have talked about them quite a bit, about the importance of trying to preserve trees and woodlands in our communities as a defense against climate change. Now, coming from Audubon, we see one thing: climate change is a big threat to birds and wildlife. They think National Audubon was saying that at least 50% of our birds are going to be displaced or become no longer, due to climate change. But the next part is also habitat fragmentation, which is we have a chance right now in Rhode Island to preserve some intact forest. After that window is open and we don't do something, that opportunity will be gone. Just as, people back in the 60s finally figured out wetlands had some value. Luckily they did, and protected wetlands, because we now certainly almost take it for granted how valuable they are. And it's not, again, wetlands are not off tax rolls. You are not forbidden to fill a wetland, but you need a permit to do it. You need to talk about mitigation in order to do those kind of things, or whatever. So there's all kinds of ways to skin a cat, if you will.
Any other questions? Okay, the sponsor of the bill is here, Representative Handy. I'm going to have him come up to speak. Any objections to that? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you over here. Representative Roberts.
Thank you. So you don't think that local cities and towns should be able to better make this decision on their own? Because this is saying that it will be managed by DEM, so now we're making this bigger government, is what we're doing, because it will say administered by the cities and towns, but DEM will oversee it.
The way I see it is that towns and town planners are overwhelmed right now, especially with the solar development, and have nothing to point to, no guidance as to how to manage remaining forests, because it's just never really been considered under law that they can then say, they're in either a state guide plan or even a town comprehensive plan. So it's not about big government, it's giving towns something to point to.
I have to disagree there. I have to say my towns where I come from, West Greenwich, Coventry, West Orange has a lot of forests over there, they're especially well run. So I would have to vote against this if it came to the floor, because they can, I believe that they can make their own decisions, and they do a wonderful job at that, so, thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, Representative Handy, could you take the microphone and speak on your bill? Mr. Taft is, Mr. Taft, you stand by.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the committee. I'm sorry, I was working my way back down here. I didn't realize you guys go to me first here anyway. And I know Mr. Taft actually maybe is maybe a little better at going deeper on some of this, but just to frame this for folks, I hear the concerns of Rep. Roberts and other folks that mentioned those concerns, Rep. Kennedy as well. This bill really is not about changing things, but rather about providing information. The idea is to make sure cities and towns have the information they need. What we've seen with the solar ordinances that some of the towns have been doing, they're sometimes, in some places, they're reacting drastically in one direction in terms of being, let's call it pro-developer, and other times they're reacting anti-developer in other directions. And largely it's without really the kind of data that they need to understand, that they need to understand what forests perhaps, or what, just like we want to make sure they know where flood maps are and things like that, we want them to also understand how these forests are important for their cities and towns, for our cities and towns in terms of the residents, in terms of the businesses and things like that. Forests are incredibly vital for have a lot of roles, but there are probably, I wouldn't be shocked if there's some large tracts of forests that are actually relatively irrelevant in many terms, in terms of habitat, in terms of drinking water, things like that. Whereas there might be another case of a really small piece of forest that's actually really important in sort of stopping, say, runoff from somewhere else. I mean, again, these are all just examples, not necessarily, I'm not going to come up with a specific for it, but I think you can picture what I mean, where a forest might be important in let's say, blocking the runoff from a large farm with a lot of fertilizer on it, for example. Or another one might be be essentially what I would call almost weed trees growing up in a spot that have just sort of come up with that fast-growing trees that just sort of look very forested. Maybe that kind of an area is not that important to try to protect in this sort of way. Instead, that might be a really viable spot for development, not just solar development, a Walmart, whatever it happens to need to be. And again, as Mr. Tapp was saying, this isn't going to preclude a town from permitting a Walmart in a forested area. I'm hoping they might not today, before this, but they might. This isn't going to preclude them that. It's not going to preclude a private homeowner or a private landowner from doing what they want with their property. What we are looking to do, though, is to really create some fact-filled information and guidance for cities and towns to use as they see fit, as they deem fit. I would think that in Exeter and West Greenwich and places like that as well, they still want that information, that data. They want to know where the floodplains are. They want to know those kinds of things. And just like this, they should also want to know where some of these really important resources are in their communities and even in surrounding communities, maybe sometimes as well. So it's not intended, I will say this year is really a discussion year for this bill. It's the first time I've got in, and really the idea here was to get this kind of a conversation started because some folks may remember last session we had what I would consider I'm going to offend people that are friendly with, but essentially a real drastic overreach, I think, in some legislation was introduced last year in terms of essentially precluding almost anything from happening in almost any piece of forest that was contiguous to, I don't remember the volume in that. I disagree with that bill as not the right strategy. I think what this is looking to do is at least get a conversation started and get the information out there. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to have you answer any questions.
Representative Walsh.
So I just want to make sure that I'm getting this right. This would be if a city or town, I know that a few of the people on this committee have been concerned about a large amount of solar farms opening up in their districts because they have wider open land. So this would be if a city planning group said, we have 3 or 4 different applications for solar farms, they could go to DEM and say, which one of these forests or woodlands would be the best place to put this to not disturb the wildlife in the area? Am I getting that?
Well, I don't know that they're going to create DM as sort of a resource to go to, but rather instead we want DM to create a resource that they can then go to and use in their analysis. I mean, planners are going to use their comprehensive plans for their cities and towns and know that this area is an area we're slotting for development, maybe some of it's forested, maybe it's not, and so they might know better how to put something in place. So I think indirectly, yes, but directly, probably no. They're not. It's not like they're going to pick up the phone and call TM and say which one of these. Probably instead they're going to have the resources because of this kind of work.
All right, awesome, thank you.
Representative McLaughlin.
Yes, Rob Handy, I'd like to see more emphasis, it was brought to your attention by,
She said that.
in reference to cities and towns, this clearly puts the state in charge. What I'm concerned about, in northern Rhode Island, I see it every day. I don't know if you people see it in your cities and towns. The animals got no place to go. We see deer crossing Mendon Road, okay? The birds are just, they're cutting down trees. And this all falls on local planning, okay, and the people involved. We currently have 229 acres in Cumberland that were purchased, and these are safe havens for, animal life and stuff like that. They're going to be turned into soccer fields. So I'd like to see a lot more legislation pertaining to cities and towns and the town planners in preserving, the wildlife and the animals that we have. They have no place to go.
I'll definitely keep that in mind too, Reverend Dalton. Thank you.
Any further questions? Yes. Representative Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only concern with this is your rural cities and towns with all the woodlands and forests. I can see in the future that if the state is doing a plan like this, passing a bond issue, buying up more of the property, taking it off the tax roll, like Representative Kennedy said. These rural cities and towns rely solely on residential tax base. The more they you take off the tax rolls, the less they have.
So, and I appreciate your concern on that point. I will say, I think Rep. Kennedy probably could reflect on this too. Residential development often actually isn't particularly great for a tax base in towns. Commercial development and retail development is probably a lot more effective in that sense. And I do know that farms, for instance, right now pay, I think, something usually like around 10 cents on the dollar in terms of the residential tax rate, if I remember the number right. And so I don't know that they're getting a lot of tax dollars from these sort of forested areas now, but maybe I'm mistaken. That's an area I'm not as familiar with.
But something is better than nothing, because once you take it off the tax rolls, it's gone. The state doesn't pay taxes. The city of town doesn't pay taxes. We have to look at this. This is, don't get me wrong, I've been in environmental business.
And to be clear, this does not request those things to occur.
Not yet.
Well, I think you
It
can find
could
other things
lead
that do
to
the
that.
same thing. I think any number of things. When we pass
You're right.
bonds, that creates the opportunity to do these same things, but maybe to do it in a haphazard fashion as opposed to a more concentrated fashion where it would fit within a town's comprehensive plan a little better. Because I would think a town would not encourage purchase of an area they've slotted for development unless the local property owner wants to sell it. They obviously can do what they wish to do.
The local land trusts, Audubon Society, different organizations. I know Providence Water up in the Situate Forest area buys a lot of land.
That's
They
to
don't
protect
pay-
the Situate Reservoir, isn't it?
It's Providence Water owns it, but they buy land all around the reservoir. They own 18, 20,000 acres of land.
They
It's
don't
all
do
off
that.
the tax
But
roll.
that's our drinking water supply we're protecting. I'm not sure.
But it's the whole city and town, the forest and woodlands. The point is, it comes off the tax roll.
I thought they paid a pilot to the Situate. Maybe I'm mistaken.
They do, they pay a fee to the town of Situate and Foster, but not nearly what it would be if it was commercial, residential.
Oh, of course.
Not-
Okay, well, we could have that conversation. I could go on all day on that one. I don't think I want to go there with you. But I just, my concern there is what's going to happen for 60% of the state's drinking water supply if you put a Walmart next to the Situate Reservoir.
That's not going to happen, and that wasn't the point. The point is, there's 20,000 acres of land up there off the local tax rolls.
Except for the pilot that they pay.
But, and you had state land on that, and you had Situate or Foster Land Trust, and other entities that take more land off the property, the tax rolls. That's my concern.
But I'm sure you wouldn't support an idea of saying a private landholder couldn't do what they wanted with their land in terms of selling it to that. So that's the thing to keep in mind in this situation.
Thank you.
Representative McAdoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rep. Handy, it's a good bill. I just have a few questions. Like in my district, Narragansett and South Kingstown, what little Narragansett has there, I believe they'll continue to preserve. But in South Kingstown, we've been very proactive. 30% of our land is preserved for open space, and there's quite a bit of forest. So my real question is about DEM. I mean, everything I hear about DEM is they're already like flat out as far as spread out too thin with staff and finances. I'm just wondering how is this going to work for them?
And I'll
To
be
just
frank.
add one more thing to them, to their responsibilities, because quite frankly, down in South County, they're very active with the water, the fishermen, and it goes on and on, and the beaches. So I'm just wondering how that's going to work.
And that's a really fair concern, because I've had a very brief conversation with some of the DEM staff, but I have not, that's why I think also this is more of that listening year, that learning year, because I share the concerns you have of there not being enough staff at DEM to do what they need to do now. This may be something that fits nice and synergistically in with what they're doing, but I'm not positive it is. And that's one of the things I'm looking forward to learning more about from DEM in this conversation today. So it's a great point, Rep.
And it appears that people don't have the stomach for increasing the beach fees and all of that, so that's not, obviously we may not be looking to that avenue to raise funds for DEM and to add personnel. So I'm just, our town does a great job in South Kingstown of preserving land, so I don't think they have to be overseen by DEM, but I'm sure many towns would, I don't know. But anyway, that's just my concern.
And I think the oversight question, maybe the language in there needs to be changed a little bit, but the intent is not to create an oversight responsibility, but rather a resource opportunity. So I'm happy to go back and revisit that language if there's concerns. I've heard that 2 or 3 times.
Thank you.